in the 1870s, and he was known as the hangman sheriff. So when somebody was sentenced to death, he was the one that tied the noose and dropped the trapdoor. I bet you didn't know that. Now, these are presidents who have served during the Civil War. Grant, who became president, and Hayes, all of those people became presidents. And all of them were generals, except for McKinley. And McKinley was a major. And his boss, or his commanding general, happened to be General Garfield. And Garfield was in charge of the 26th Ohio Regiment, where McKinley was a major, and they were both fought in the Battle of Shiloh. Now, the only other president, this will really get to you, that who came directly from civilian life, besides Trump, was Abraham Lincoln. Now, he had been a congressman about 20 years before that. He was a congressman for only one term and only lasted 2 years. And he came right out of civilian life, 14 years as a civilian country lawyer. So he got his reputation of being on the stump against Stephen A. Douglas in the senatorial race for Illinois in 1858. And it became very famous, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and he used to go all over the country. But Lincoln only served 2 years, and when the Mexican War broke out, there was a vote of who should go to war and who shouldn't, and he was the only dissenting vote, saying, this is a war of conquest and American domain, manifest destiny, and I'm not voting for it. So that's a little thing about Lincoln you might not know. Presidents that were assassinated in the 19th century: Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. Lincoln died instantly. Garfield suffered for almost 3 months. He got shot about 4 weeks after he was inaugurated in March. Back then they inaugurated in March. He didn't die until September, and he died of blood poisoning. This is one of my favorite slides because it has a lot of history to it. And people call that maybe divine intervention. 2 presidents who were the original founding fathers died exactly on the same day and same year, 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1836. Now, Adams and Jefferson were very bitter rivals. Jefferson was Adams' vice president. And when Adams tried to run for president, Jefferson beat him, and he kept that against him for years. For 20 years or so, they exchanged very nasty letters and philosophical letters. But they reconciled in the later years of their life. And John Adams' last words before expiring was, "Jefferson still lives." He wasn't aware that Jefferson died hours earlier at Monticello. Thomas Jefferson's last words were, "Is it the 4th yet?" Because he'd been drifting in and out of a coma for several days, dying very slowly, a natural death. And every day he would ask, "Is it the 4th yet?" And the last day, on July 4th, he asked, "Is it the 4th yet?" And then he died. Sitting at his bedside was a slave mistress, Sally Hemings. She had been with him all along. Now, historians wonder if this was a sign of divine intervention by God. One other president died on July 4th, and that was James Monroe, but that was later on, not until about 1840. Unsuccessful assassination attempts on all U.S. presidents. Andrew Jackson, 1836. I have a story about him in just a few minutes. Abraham Lincoln, 1861. That was the attempt. He had to come into Washington in disguise on a closed down railroad car, sleeping car, and with a cape and a slouch hat on, and facial disguise, because the Secret Service and Pinkertons back then had word that there was an assassination attempt. So he snuck in successfully, but then later he was assassinated. Theodore Roosevelt, as a presidential candidate, now he had already served as president for 1.5 terms. He finished William McKinley's term, and he got reelected. He got elected with the promise that he wished he never ever made, that he regretted forever. He said, "I will only run one term, and I will not re-run again." But he had so much fun as president, and had so much power, and changed so many things in the country, and came down hard on big businesses and busting up trust systems, that he felt that he could be of more use. But he kept his word and didn't run again on the ticket. So he was off for about 4 years, and his successor, William Howard Taft, who was his Secretary of State, he won the election. But before that, Teddy Roosevelt started his own third party called the Bull Moose Party, and it was a progressive party. Well, he got a lot of votes, and Taft almost got elected, but he split enough votes that it went to Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson was the one that ended up getting elected. Franklin Roosevelt, a lot of people don't realize that there was an attempt on Franklin Roosevelt's life. And that happened in Miami, Florida during the Democratic Convention of 1933. There was an assassin who shot at the stage, and they got Franklin out of it, but one of the stray bullets hit the mayor of Chicago, who was one of the speakers, and killed him. So he had a royal funeral that Franklin attended. Harry S. Truman, 1950. That's when Puerto Rican separatists who wanted to have Puerto Rico break away and form its own state burst into the White House with guns blazing, and they killed 2 of the White House guards before they were gunned down themselves. They also tried to break into the House of Representatives and shoot that place up, but they were killed by Secret Service. Gerald Ford, twice in 4 weeks, by 2 women. Both of them were sentenced to life. One of them was Squeaky Throne, who was one of Charles Manson's ladies from the Manson murders. And then Ronald Reagan, 1981, about 3 or 4 months after he was inaugurated, he was leading a union convention where he gave a speech, and Hinckley went and shot him, and he nearly killed him. Reagan was able to walk into the hospital where he kiddingly said, I forgot to duck, But he got patched up, and for a short time, Gerald Ford was, with the 23rd Amendment, temporary president of the United States until Reagan could become capacitated again. 'Cause Is there a doctor in the house? Anybody here a doctor? Okay, well, let me tell you something. Presidents who died in office, other than from assassination, but from disease. William Henry Harrison, otherwise known as the guy who never listened to Mom, who told him he died death of cold if he went outside on a winter day without wearing his warm hat and coat. He didn't listen. Term of office, 30 days. So if you leave here remembering anything, and somebody says, geez, who's the shortest term president? Said, William Henry Harrison, 30 days. Well, how did he die? Well, I'm going to tell you. He was about almost 70 years old, and all he had going for him was his reputation as a general from 35 years before, during the War of 1812, where he fought on the Indiana frontier, and he was made the military governor of Indiana, and Battle of Tippecanoe. He won the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that's where you hear the name Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, he lasted. What happened was he was made fun of because he was so old. They said, we're not having an old guy like this running for president. So he wanted to prove to the people that he was young and vigorous, and he had a lot of machismo behind him. So he comes marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in March, and it happened to be a very cold, windy, damp day in March. He didn't have a hat on or a coat, and he wanted to show people how brave and how strong and virile he was. So he gets up and he makes, to this day, the longest inauguration speech, 1 hour, 45 minutes, 1,495 words. That kept him up on the podium a long time. So he caught cold. 2 or 3 days later, while he was picking vegetables in his garden, it was raining, got damp, he ended up catching pneumonia. Well, he ended up becoming bedridden. Pneumonia turned to blood poisoning, and he died 30 days later from the time of the inauguration, from March 4th and April 4th. His wife wasn't even there. She was home. She hadn't even had a chance to get to the inauguration because she was delayed by bad roads. Now, Zachary Taylor, who was known for being an old rough and ready as a general in the Mexican War, he was otherwise finding out life is not a bowl of cherries. 16 months, 1850. I'll tell you about Zachary. Oh, you can't see the background, but I can read it for you. It shows up on the screen, but it's not. See, maybe the next one. There we go. He was the second president to die from illness in office, and the second president to die in the White House. He died in office from cholera morbus, contracted from eating a bowl of cherries and drinking a pitcher of ice milk on July 4th, 1850. A hot, humid day. Taylor had his dinner sometime later with the ice milk and the cherries in a bowl. All foods and liquors so the residents of Washington were warned not to eat because of a ongoing cholera epidemic. Taylor spent an uncomfortable night, and the next day his symptoms worsened. Doctors diagnosed cholera and prescribed opium, which was very common in those days. That Monday he predicted, I will be a dead man. And in 2 days, late in Tuesday, his prediction was correct and he died. Cherries and milk. Presidents who lost children during their term in office: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Franklin Pierce, Abraham Lincoln, also John Tyler, Rutherford Hayes, William McKinley, FDR, Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush Sr. Those were during their term in office. Presidents' wives who died in office. Latina Tyler, 1842, and Caroline Harrison, 1892, 50 years later. I'll just review this quickly. Abraham Lincoln, 11-year-old son Willie, died in 1862, the one who addressed the Civil War era in the midst of the Civil War. But as in Joe Biden's case, he was the second of Lincoln's children to die. Young Edward Lincoln had succumbed to diphtheria in 1850 at the age of 3. You never hear about little Edward. I didn't know that he existed until I did my research. He died at the age of, and Edward Lincoln had died of diphtheria at age 3. Tad died of office, died at 18. And just days before Franklin Pierce's inauguration as 14th president, his son Benny was killed in a train wreck before his parents' eyes. He was the third of the Pierce's children and the third to precede his parents to death. Even worse was the fate of Thomas Jefferson, who buried 5 of 6 children he had with his wife Martha, who also died at 33. The death of Polly plunged Jefferson into deep despair. He wrote his old surviving child, Patsy, that he yearned to be free of political obligations, that he was reelected. Hayes had 7 children. 3 died before their 2nd birthday. John Tyler lost 3 of his adult daughters within a 6-year period. So they're not immune to death in the family. Presidents who went back to serve in lesser political office and after finishing their term. John Quincy Adams, he also defended people in Armistead. He served in the House of Representatives for 17 years after leaving the presidency. And he remains the only president to hold office in the House after his presidential term expired. He died in the Speaker's chamber of the House from a stroke. And also, he's defended the mutineers' escaped slaves on the Armistead Mutiny and won their freedom. He was portrayed in the Steven Spielberg movie by the distinguished British actor Anthony Hopkins. Now, Andrew Johnson, who was the Rascallian vice president who became president on the death of Lincoln, he returned to Tennessee after the presidency and sought political vindication and gained it in the eyes of when he was elected to the Senate again in 1875. So this was like 8 years after he got out of office. The only former president to serve there just months before his death. So he was only in the Senate for 3 or 4 months before he died. Here is an interesting story about John Tyler. He is the one who succeeded William Henry Harrison, the 30-day wonder of president, and the first president who ever succeeded on the Presidential Succession Act. As the Civil War, Tyler spoke for succession. Now, he'd already been out of office since 1844. He was the only president to join the Confederacy. He was elected as a congressional representative of the Confederate States of America, but he died January 18, 1862, at the age of 71, before he could take a seat. In the North, Tyler was considered a traitor for joining the Confederacy, the only president to ever do so, and no official notice was taken of his passing in Washington, and a monument was not erected until 1915. Howard Taft, the president who succeeded Teddy Roosevelt, He served as Chief Justice of the United States from 1921 to 1930, after his president. That was a job he always wanted instead of the presidency. And he served twice as long as he did as President of the United States. And here's other American citizens who became presidents of other countries, not considered the United States of America. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, who was a senator from Mississippi, and he was also Secretary of War. And Sam Houston, who was the President of the Republic of Texas, was a separate independent country. It was a republic twice, 1836 from the time of the Alamo, and again from 1841 to 1844. He was very, very much against his own native state of Texas seceding from the Union and joining the South. And he was scorned for that and almost put into isolation. They just ignored him and they didn't pay any attention to him. Thomas Jefferson was the third president. The number of terms elected was 2. His post-presidential period, he retired from being president after a second term. He felt anguish and release from change. He hated being president, along with 3 or 4 other presidents who always said the same thing. You know, if you enjoy being president as much as I hated it, you will be one happy man. Buchanan said that to Lincoln. He didn't want to re-enter public life. He spent time at Monticello. He was deeply in debt by 1815, and he sold his library to form the Library of Congress to help get him out. They had to rebuild the Library of Congress because it had been burned by the British during the War of 1812. He spent a lot of time in retirement presiding at the University of Virginia, and he died on his 50th anniversary of Declaration of Independence. It was the same day as John Adams. After he died, he was $110,000 in debt, and his daughter Martha had to sell Monticello and all of his possessions to pay it out. It became privately owned for about 100 years. Now, Jefferson and Adams were the only 2 presidents to sign the Declaration. Jefferson designed his own tombstone and wrote his own epitaph, omitting the fact that he was president. He sold the library of 6,000 books for $23,950 to replace those that were burned at the sack of Washington and formed the basis of new. It said that it took 100 wagon loads, horse-drawn wagon loads, to transport 6,000 books. Somebody asked me at one of my talks, well, how come he got so deeply in debt? Because he liked to spend money. He never watched his purse strings or his budget. And one of the things he would spend money on very freely is for self-pleasure and educating himself, for books and very expensive imported wine. He loved his wine. He had a huge wine cellar, and those didn't go for $1.50 for Apple or Ripple. So that's Thomas Jefferson. James Madison, interesting story about him. He was a quick list of facts. He was called Father of the Constitution. Jefferson was called Father of the Declaration. He was Father of the Constitution, helped draft it and helped write it. He was president during the War of 1812, which critics dubbed Mr. Madison's War. There was almost a succession of states when that war broke out. The New England states didn't want to have anything to do with it, and they were ready to succeed because they were going to lose a lot of commerce and shipping from both France and England, from the harbors and the ports. in England from places that would be bringing in wine, livestock, all of those things. So when the British Army invaded Washington during the War of 1812, Dolly Madison rescued a portrait of George Washington along with other valuables from the White House and fled the city. British casualties during the Battle of New Orleans numbered more than 2,289 killed. Americans only 71, 31 killed. So major events was the War of 1812, Star Spangled Banner written, the Treaty of Ghent. Battle of New Orleans, by the way, happened 4 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Andrew Jackson, way down in New Orleans, that didn't know that the war was over because communications, you didn't have telephone, so it had to be traveled by sea. And so they fought a battle and won it after a peace treaty had been signed, which turned out to be a draw. Both sides went back to the original contents of what they had asked for and didn't expand any territory. Louisiana Purchase was going on. Now here's the thing with Dolly Madison. Dolly takes charge and saves Washington's portrait off the wall before the British get there. Now here's an interesting story. The British had already started invading Washington, D.C. and were marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. And they were 4 blocks away from the White House. And the servants, by then, James Madison had already fled. He had first went down to the front lines and was directing artillery at the British until they had to withdraw. So he crossed the Potomac into Virginia. Now they're about a mile or so away from the White House. They'd already burned Congress, they had burned the harbor, and they were heading down there. They wanted to burn the president's house, which is what it was called until Teddy Roosevelt made it the White House. The servant said, Dolly, Madam First Lady, you've got to get out of here. She said, I'm not leaving until I take that picture of Gilbert Stuart, of George Washington with me. So they tried to get it off the wall, and it was screwed to the wall. And they were short on time, so one of the servants took a steak knife and just cut it out of the frame, and then unrolled it and rolled the thing up, put it in the wagon, and off they went. And it's been a very famous story, and it's a true story, and that's what the White House looked like after it was burned. It took 3 to 4 years to restore it again, and it was just a charged shell, hollow on the inside. By the way, a little trivia about Dolly Madison. She loved ice cream, and her favorite flavor was oyster. Oyster flavored ice cream. Now we get to Andrew Jackson. Now Andrew was the 7th president, fast facts, and his first lady was a widow, and he was a widower. She died in 1828. 2 weeks before inauguration after picking out her gown. She died from a heart attack brought on by heartbreak and stress over slanderous attacks made against her because she thought she had been legally divorced, but her husband never sought divorce papers. So she was, quote, living in sin, in bigamy with Andrew, and he didn't know either because they couldn't find the husband to trace him down. So, during his period of time, there was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, known as the Trail of Tears, which is what you see down there. And they expelled, there was a lawsuit by the state of Georgia, Worcester versus Georgia, that said they could not be forced to move. And the Supreme Court held that up. Well, Jackson ignored the court order and gave Justice Marshall and said, let them try to enforce it. It's what's called the Trail of Tears. U.S. troops led 15,000 Cherokees from Georgia reservations to Oklahoma, barren land that they weren't familiar with. It's estimated that 4,000 natives died. Jackson was the first president to survive an assassination attempt in 1835 when two carriages pointed at him didn't fire. The gunman, Richard Lawrence, was beaten down by Jackson with his cane and subdued by Congressman Davy Crockett, who was standing next to him. The prosecuting federal prosecutor who prosecuted Richard Lawrence was none other than Francis Scott Key in Belgium. So he was found not guilty for the attempt of insanity. Jackson's wife, Rachel, was charged with adultery when it was discovered her first husband never filed for divorce. Now, he killed Dickerson in a duel, which thought to preserve his wife's honor, was involved in several duels, killed several men, and carried 2 bullets in his chest for the rest of his life after a brawl with Thomas Hart Benton. Now, after Jefferson was elected, who was a very popular thing, here is the assassination attempt, and he beat him senseless with his cane. You don't go after Andrew Jackson, he gets really ticked off. And next to him over there is Davy Crockett. Both derriches misfire. They said the chances of that happening is 1 in 100,000, with 2 derriches not firing. Now, his open house reception to the public after inauguration was a mob scene, equivalent to today's Black Friday at Walmart or fraternity beer blast at Animal House. 20,000 people followed in a caravan from the Capitol to the White House to party with him. Farm animals in the halls, drapes were pulled down, drunken public, china and windows broken. Jackson had to be scurried out through a window for his own safety, and the only way they got the people out of the White House was to bring their spiked punch bowl out on the lawn. There's the William Henry Harrison. I told you about him. He served 1 month, shortest term, and he was vice president. His death set the precedent for how a funeral is conducted in Washington for a president who dies in office. Black bunting on the buildings, Quezon's funeral cortege, and lying in state. They had no idea how to handle a wake and a funeral for a president. William Henry Harrison, or John Tyler, he was the one who succeeded Harrison, and he was the 10th president. Now, they called him his excellency because they didn't, his cabinet and the Senate didn't take his candidacy and his his presidency as legitimate. So when he got back to the White House, Daniel Webster, who was the Secretary of State of the Cabinet, said, you just have kind of a title. We'll take care of all of the affairs, and we'll actually run the government. To which Tyler snapped back, I am the President of the United States. If it is against your wishes, you may all resign. 1 month later, the cabinet all resigned except for Daniel Webster. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He had 14 children, 7 daughters, 7 sons, and this slide is a couple of years old. Grandchildren are still living today. 1790, President Tyler born. 1853, his son Lyndon Grandin Tyler is born. 1924, Lyndon Tyler Graham Jr. is still living today. Should be in his 90s. He just passed away 3 years ago. I personally worked with a guy at Genesee Country Village who actually met the grandson of William Tyler. Now, his post-presidential period, he didn't run for re-election in 1844. He retired to his farm in Virginia and served as Chancellor of College of William and Mary. And he spoke of succession. He was elected a congressional representative, but he died at 71, taking his seat. And as I said before, he was known for being a traitor. Abraham Lincoln, major events while he was in office. He had no middle name, and Lincoln had 18 months of formal education. He loved reading and educated himself first as a lawyer. Lincoln and his wife had 4 sons, only one of whom would survive past the age of 18, and that was Robert. And Robert lived to the 1930s, and he was there at the dedication of the Lincoln Monument, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. An example of Lincoln's honesty is the fact that he paid back every last penny of the $1,000. It took him 17 years to do so. He was challenged to a duel over a letter his wife wrote. The duel never took place due to Abe's choice of weapons, the broadsword. Due to Lincoln's long arms and his much smaller opponent, the opponent decided it was best to settle the issue without a fight. He was the only U.S. president to obtain a U.S. patent, and during his term, the population was 32 million. His son Robert was in the vicinity of the assassination of 3 presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. He was the first president born outside of the original 13 colonies. Just 1 month after his inauguration, the Civil War began. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Here we go. The legend of Clara Harris's dress is on April 14th, 9 days after Civil War ended. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris accepted an invitation to join Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln in a private box to go to Ford Theater and see our American cousin. The couple, who had been friends with the president's wife for some time, were invited after Ulysses Grant and Julia Grant begged off. Julia Grant couldn't stand Mary Todd. She thought she was obnoxious. Thomas Eckert and several other people had declined Lincoln's invitation. Now, while watching our American cousin in the presidential box that evening, John Booth shot President Lincoln in the back of the head. While attempting to apprehend Booth after the shooting, Booth slashed Major Rathbone in the left arm with a Bowie knife to his shoulder. Rathbone lost a considerable amount of blood, which stained Harris's dress, now Mrs. Lincoln, her face, hands when she attempted to aid him. Despite being seriously wounded, Rathbone had escorted the First Lady Mary Lincoln to the Peterson house, where doctors had decided to take the mortally wounded Lincoln to lay there and rest and die, and held Rathbone's head in her lap while he drifted in and out of consciousness. A surgeon who had been attending the president finally examined Rathbone and realized her wound was more serious than initially thought. It had severed an artery located above his elbow and had cut nearly to the bone. He was taken home, and Harris decided to stay with Mrs. Lincoln later. And she said, poor Mrs. Lincoln, all through that dreadful night, she would look at me in honor and scream and say, oh, my poor husband's blood, my poor husband's blood. It was Henry's blood, not the president's, but explanations were pointless. The story gets better. Sarah Harris's blood-stained dress. It's a picture of it. While Rathbone recovered from the attack, President Lincoln died of his wound. After the assassination, Rathbone blamed himself for not preventing Lincoln's death. Fear and guilt and paranoia set in. He spent the remainder of his life battling delusions and seeking treatments for other physical ailments, including constant headaches. Every year, on the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, journalists would contact the couple with questions about Lincoln's death. That was the paparazzi of those days. And his Rathbone's feeling of guilt. He said, as the time went on, Rathbone's mental insanity
instability worsened, and he often became jealous of other men who paid attention to Harris and resented the attention Harris paid their children. He reportedly threatened his wife on several occasions and convinced that Harris was going to divorce him and take the children. So despite all of this, despite his behavior, Rathbone was appointed U.S. Consul to the province of Hanover. Now back then, the ambassadors were called consuls. They were not called ambassadors. Province of Hanover was a portion, a province of Germany, just like some of the other ones that they have there. Now he was appointed by President Chester Arthur. The family relocated to Germany, Bavaria, that's what I said. And Rathbone's mental health continued to decline. Now here's the kicker. On December 23rd, 1883, Rathbone attacked his children in a fit of madness. While attempting to protect her children, Clara Harris was fatally shot by her husband Rathbone, who then stabbed himself 5 times in an attempted suicide. Rathbone was charged with murder, but was declared insane by doctors after blaming the murder on an intruder. He was convicted and sent to an asylum for the criminally insane in Hausberg, Germany, where he died in 1911. The children's couple, the couple's children were sent to live with their Uncle Willie Harris in the United States, in Albany, New York. Now, Clara Harris kept that bloody dress she wore the night of the assassination. Unable to bring herself to wash or destroy it, she eventually stored it in a closet in the family summer home, bricked up in Albany. After experiencing what she claimed was a visit from Lincoln's ghost, Harris had the closet in which this thing was stored filled with bricks. In 1910, Henry Riggs Rathbone was stored, and Rathbone's other son removed the bricks and had the dress destroyed and burned, claiming that it was a curse on the family. Ulysses Grant, did you know he was fined $20 by the D.C. Police Department for speeding in his carriage down Pennsylvania Avenue? Even though he had throat cancer due to extreme cigar smoking, up to 20 cigars a day, he finished his memoirs and had them published with the help of Mark Twain before his death, which dug him out of financial ruin and proved him with security for an easy death. It was a big seller. I bought that book, most boring book you ever wanted to read. I couldn't get through it. I mean, it was every single detail. After Grant retired from the presidency, he and his wife traveled throughout Europe and Asia and Africa and were greeted and heralded like royalty. In the same way, he had a huge royal funeral, a presidential funeral when he died. And that's when Grant's tomb was formed. John Garfield, he too was assassinated. And what I think lingering, number of terms, was shot on July 2nd, and he died on September 15th. Now, by Charles Guiteau, a disturbed office seeker, who shot the president in the back. The president did not die until the 19th of blood poisoning. This was related more to the manner in which physicians attending the president than to the wounds themselves. Guiteau was convicted of murder and hanged. Now, they tried probing with their fingers. No gloves on, no anesthetic, Civil War style, looking for that bullet. And so naturally, it became infected and became bacteria. And so it got into his bloodstream. The last-ditch efforts was they called in Alexander Graham Bell, who had just invented the telephone. And he had a very primitive, first of its kind, metal detector. So they put the metal detector under his back
to see if they could pick out the metal and the location of where that lead was in. They didn't. It screwed up the metal detector. It was getting all kinds of signals. Little did they know until afterwards what it was picking up was those springs, the metal springs in the box springs, and it wasn't detecting the bullet. So he entertained friends by writing Latin in one hand and Greek in the other simultaneously. He was the last president to be born in a log cabin. After serving only a few months, he became the second president to become assassinated, and Lucinda Garfield was an invalid when her husband was shot. She remained at his side for 3 months while he fought back. A brave man is a man who dares to look the devil in his face and tell him he is the devil. And our last slide was here. Make sure that is the last one. We'll finish that just about on time. The incomparable Teddy Roosevelt. Let's do the cool facts about him first. Now, Teddy Roosevelt had 6 children. Alice, Ted, Kermit, Ethel, Archie, and Quentin. 4 boys, 2 girls. All of the boys served in both World War I and World War II. Quentin was shot down as an American aviator over France in a biplane by Germans, and they found his body. The German troops found his body. They looked at his ID, recognized who he was, and treated him with a great reverence and honor. And they gave him a total royal military funeral and had it photographed and sent a picture to the president. And the president said, leave him buried where he lay. One of the others, Archie, Kermit, he had alcoholism and depression, and he served in the Army up in Alaska in 1943. He ended up committing suicide. And Teddy Jr. was featured in the movie The Longest Day by Henry Fonda, and he played Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, and he was the only general to land on Omaha Beach during the invasion of Normandy. And his son, Quentin Jr., was also on Normandy, but Teddy was on Utah Beach, and he landed 2 miles away from where they were supposed to. So his quote was, well, we're going to start the war right from here. This is a lady. Sometimes Roosevelt would read 2 or 3 books a day and drink a gallon of coffee a day. I can't imagine that. No matter he was wired. So he did not have a middle name. The teddy bear is named after him. Theodore Roosevelt wasn't the first. He was the first to go in a submarine. It was called the Plunger. He was the first president to leave the country, the first president to fly in an airplane, and there was an attempted assassination on him, but he kept right on talking. In October 1912, when he was running as a progressive candidate for the Bull Moose Party, he was campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when a local saloon keeper shot him. Well, the bullet lodged in his chest after passing through his jacket pocket containing his steel eyeglasses case and a copy of his 50-page speech, which had been folded in half, thereby making it 100 pages. Being an autonomist himself, Roosevelt concluded that since he wasn't coughing up blood, the bullet had not penetrated the chest wall, so it remained in the chest muscle and into his lung. So he declined immediate attention treatment and gave a 90-minute speech with blood seeping from his wound to his shirt. And he stopped and said to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully realize this, but I have just been shot. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He wanted the shooter to be brought before him, told the police. They were ready to lynch him on the spot and beat him to death in the crowd. They said, "No, bring him here." And he said, "I just wanted to look at you in the face and wanted to know why you tried to shoot me." drunk. He was convicted of a crime and sent to prison. And the last little thing about him was, he was a skinny dipper. He was known to go skinny dipping in the Potomac River during winter time, and he kind of insisted that his cabinet go along with him. Here we have a polo ground. Teddy had the Potomac River. And that, my folks, is your 19th century presidential trivia program. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope I can get asked back and do any more things from it. Is there